I'm Holly Brown, and this is the story behind my story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Tim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Matthew Betley.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You know, we're quickly approaching 400 episodes. It blows my mind to look back and think about the shows that we've been able to do, and looking at the calendar at the shows that we have scheduled. Really, really phenomenal stuff coming up. It's amazing to me sometimes to think about the amount of people that we have not talked to yet on the show. And Dawn keeps scheduling excellent authors from every genre just about every day. So thank you for tuning in and listening. And just because we're about to hit 400 episodes does not mean we're slowing down anytime soon. So be sure to go over to hankgarner.com and subscribe to the show. There's handy links in the sidebar where you can subscribe on your favorite podcast app, on your phone, on your computer, wherever you do it. You can find links there. You also find us on YouTube. There's a link in the sidebar as well. I'd like to thank some sponsors who faithfully support the show and allow us to do what we do. One of those is Scott Woodley from marlowemoss.net. Scott is an excellent editor, and authors, what you don't know can hurt you. A lot of times we think that you can just do a cursory read over and then hit that publish button. I can tell you from experience that even, having proofreaders and, going over it yourself, things still fall through the cracks no matter how attentive to details you are. That's why you need an editor who can come in and give you that other set of eyes and who understands the story process to help you make your story the best it can be. At marlowemoss.net, Scott will give you a free sample edit, and he can show you how he can help your story be the best it can be. You can go to marlowemoss.net today, and you can read some testimonials and see how he can help you turn your sentences into inspired sentences and polished paragraphs for print-worthy books. He has competitive rates and always delivers on time. He offers a full range of editorial and ghostwriting services to self-published and traditionally published authors. Turn your ideas into words and see your dreams become books. marlowemoss.net. Also, I'd like to thank Richard Thomas for sponsoring the show. Richard has an online fiction writers course, the University of Richard. And there's a link in the show notes. There's a banner there where you can click on and you can see the course guide. Lots and lots of classes coming up. He can help teach you to be the best writer you can be. There's classes coming up for the 2018 and 2019 season, like short story mechanics, writing flash fiction, contemporary dark fiction, advanced creative writing workshops, how to write a novel in a year, lots and lots of stuff from a very prolific and excellent writer, Richard Thomas, teaching you how to be the best writer you can be. It's the University of Richard. There's a link in the show notes. I'd also like to tell you about a new sponsor, George Kramer, and his new book, Blind to Blood. Ben Bergstall had a unique job. He was a tissue procurement specialist. When someone died, he would surgically remove people's body parts for donation. He really enjoyed doing it. So much so, when an anonymous email asked him to consider recovering people's body parts on the side, he was more than happy to oblige. The trouble was Ben sought out live people to fulfill his clandestine clients' needs. Read all about Ben's exploits in this riveting book that delves into tissue procurement, Blind to Blood by George Kramer. Pick up your copy today on Amazon and find out why people are saying this is an intense page-turner, that they are also fascinated by digging into the mind of Ben and finding out how he works. If you would like to see a look into the darker side of humanity, pick up Blind to Blood, the riveting new page-turner by George Kramer. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. By the way, Richard is going to be my guest on episode 400 coming up, and I have been reading the Jason Crane series, book 4, before anybody else has. So I'm pretty excited about that. Excellent stuff coming up. And yeah, I think you're going to love it. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Holly Brown on the show with me today. Holly has a brand new book out. It just came out yesterday, and you can go get your hands on it now. It's called How Far She's Come, and this is an epic thriller. I think you guys are really going to love it. Welcome to the show, Holly.
Thank you so much.
Holly, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Yes, I'm really bad at placing events in their time frame, so I don't know if I started writing at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, but I know I started with song lyrics, and I had my versions of Aesop's fables that I would write, and I don't think I actually called them Holly's fables. I don't think I was quite that self-involved, but I felt somehow that I could rival Aesop, and I think in part it was my family was just incredibly sure of my talent, and so that was kind of nice to have. It's also kind of it can be scary when you hit the real world, much later. But my grandfather would put everything in this protective cellophane, and he would save it, and he would say that someday I'm going to write the great American novel, which is obviously a very kind of antiquated idea that there's kind of one novel that would encapsulate America, But I appreciate the validation. So there was a lot of that came from my family, with the idea that kind of I was the writer, and so it seemed really inevitable that I'd make my living that way, and so. I don't remember when exactly I realized it was a career, as opposed to just sort of this thing I was always going to do. And but I know that I didn't really have any other career choice growing up. I don't remember ever saying I wanted to be an actress or a circus performer or an astronaut or anything else. And so my grandfather's saying was a writer writes, and that was really helpful because it kind of meant you're not defined just by whether you're published. You're defined through the act itself, and if that's enough. But of course he wanted me to be published, and or he wouldn't have said that about the whole great American novel thing, and I wanted to be too, but I can't remember at what point that was that I wanted to be published, and when that became a motivator more than the act of writing, which is one of the strange things that happens with the world of writing, when you're sort of trying to commodify this thing that you just do, and I think that's a struggle I think a lot of writers have of kind of not even art versus commerce, but for me just kind of enjoyment and personal validation versus trying to get make a living and get validation from the broader world in terms of masses of people liking what you do, and so I think all of that is sort of part of the writer's journey.
Oh, for sure. And that's why I say a writer or storyteller in that first question, because I think that people are born storytellers. And whether you then take that skill or gift or whatever, luck of DNA, whatever it is, that wherever that comes from, whether you then parlay that into a career and all that's great. But I think there are special people that are just storytellers. And I love when I hear that there's a family member or a teacher or something, that recognizes that in a kid and gives them that encouragement and motivation. And I talk about that all the time because it's just so important to me, that I've seen it over and over and over again. And that people well into their middle age and old age talk about that one person that encouraged them and pushed them to use their gift. And I just love that. And I also love hearing that people were going to write, whether that becomes a career or not. Was that something that you continued, into adolescence and things? We tend to, when we're teenagers, lose some of those early the early wonder of things because we get caught up in, being teenagers and all that stuff. Was that something that carried through with you, or did you come back to writing later?
It carried through in terms of my adolescence. I remember being really inspired by the idea that S.E. Hinton, I read a lot of S.E. Hinton, like The Outsiders, and That Was Then, This Is Now, and she was really phenomenal. Her stuff still is, I imagine. I haven't tried to reread it as an adult, but she was, I think, 15 or 16 when she was first published, and she was writing about adolescence, and I remember being really inspired because I was like, oh, you can write about it as you live it, like you can write these. I don't think YA was, I don't remember knowing YA as a category. I'm sure it existed. I'm sure it was called young adult, but I don't remember thinking in those terms. I remember thinking, oh, teenagers can write for other teenagers, and that was a really exciting idea for me. And so I was writing my own YA novels like through my teen years, and in terms of just the whole supportive family thing, I remember my father. I grew up in Philadelphia. And my father drove me down to there was one agent, one literary agent in Philadelphia, and I have no idea if he even did YA novels. I don't even know what that guy was up to, but I remember that I literally printed out my book, and my father drove me down, and I just walked in, and I said, there's a receptionist sitting there, and I'm like this pimple-faced kind of awkward person, and I go in, and I'm like, here's my novel, and she was really sweet to me, even though I'm sure that I can't imagine that's at all how anything was ever done, but I was just, so earnest and hopeful, and I got a form rejection back, at some point. But it said keep writing at the bottom of it, and I'm sure the receptionist relayed just kind of how I think I might have been shaking as I brought my manuscript to her. But I think what I remember in sort of most fondly, and I don't think I understood it at the time that it was really a wonderful thing, that my parents never acted like it was goofy that I was putting myself out there in that way. They didn't say, oh, well, they're not going to really want to, buy a book from a 16-year-old, or I don't remember if 15 or 16. But nobody thought that I was doing something silly. It was treated like it was a totally reasonable plan for a person with my degree of talent, and so they just said, put yourself out there. And I do think that's a very motivating thing for me. The idea that you just go for it, and you just believe that you can do it, and then when you get crushed along the way, but you have to be tenacious, and you have to believe in your talent ultimately, and believe that you can get better also, because I don't think talent is enough. I definitely think that there's talent and luck and hard work and all those components, but the luck never hits if you don't have the other ingredients, and you're not sort of positioning yourself in a way that it can hit.
Oh, exactly. And, that adage that's, kind of almost become a cliche is the harder you work, the luckier you get. There's mm-hmm. a lot of truth to that, and mm-hmm. it's just the way it works. So after that, harrowing experience at the literary agent's office. What was the piece that you wrote that did get attention?
Well, I published a couple of chick lit books close to 15 years ago, and so those were a lot of fun, and they weren't ultimately what I wanted to write, but it was it was learning about the publishing industry, which was really helpful. And then I wanted to move away from that, and I ended up losing my agent in the process, and so then it was basically starting over. And at that point, I think I wrote at least 6 different books. I write fast, which is good. At least it lets you get rejected fast, and it lets you get back to the drawing board fast. And I tried to get a new agent for all of those, and it didn't work out. And I think sometimes it was that the ideas themselves weren't actually good enough. They weren't marketable enough. But I think sometimes the execution wasn't good enough. And there's one book that I continue to really adore, and I'm really proud of, and I hope something happens with it someday. But I about 6 years ago, I had my daughter, and I was driving to work one day, soon after the maternity leave had ended, and I was listening to NPR, and there was a man being interviewed, and his name was Tony Loftus. And he had a teenage daughter who had run away, and he'd used social media to find her and bring her home. And he had started a nonprofit to help other parents do the same thing. And so as a parent, of a baby, I was kind of interested in the idea of like, his experience as a fellow parent, much further down the road. And so I was sort of grabbed by that. And also being a therapist who's worked with a lot of adolescents, I was interested in that. But then the writer in me got really engaged when he talked about how if parents went that route, they needed to make sure they didn't have any skeletons in their closet because it would all come out. And so then that captured my imagination, like who would the mother be and who would the daughter be, and what if they both have secrets, and what are those secrets, and how do they play out in this in this sphere, in this social media circus sphere. And so that formed the basis of my novel, Don't Try to Find Me, and then that allowed me to get a wonderful agent, and then a wonderful editor at HarperCollins, and so now I'm up to my fourth book with them, which is the one that just came out.
You said a lot in there that I really want to touch on, and you mentioned a couple of times that you're a therapist, and I want to come back to that in just a minute. But you said something about those early novels that you wrote, and that maybe they just weren't the right idea or weren't the right. I forget the word that you used, but. In essence, were you saying that the plot was not compelling, the characters weren't compelling? What do you think it was about that didn't resonate with other people, and then as you looked back at it, maybe didn't even resonate with you? Right.
Some didn't resonate with me. It's true. When I went back to them, I feel like agents seem to either have a really strong response where you get a lot of interest, or at least this was my experience. The two times I've gotten agents, I got multiple offers both times, and so something spoke to a lot of people in their gut, and other things spoke to no one, I noticed. So it was sort of my times that it hit, it was like it had been that a whole bunch of people saw something in that. And so I think sometimes that the idea, it's just not hooky enough. I mean, because the reality is that I'm writing commercial fiction, and so the elevator pitch is counts for a lot. I did a little bit of time at an MFA program where you're writing, it's more focused on the sentences and the characters, and what I think of as MFA novels are different than commercial novels, and so the sort of high literary is different. And then I don't think it has to be quite so hooky, even though I feel like that's starting to change too. I think literary novels need to be hookier. But yeah, so that's what I mean, is just sort of capturing people just from like a really brief, like what if, that what if moment that you had Amy Molloy on your show, who had written the Perfect Mother. Am I getting the title? Am I recalling the title? And it's just that one sentence that just everybody knows. Everybody knows that's the book. That's the book of the summer. That's what they want to read. And so I do think if you're writing commercial fiction, and hopefully you're doing it in a way that's well executed and has some literary merit, but you're still trying to grab people. And so if you work on what I think of as the wrong idea, as in it's not going to grab people right from your first query letter to the agent, then you can lose a lot of time, and you don't get where you want to go.
Well, that argument of literary versus commercial is a good one to ponder, because you definitely don't want to write anything that you'll be embarrassed by in 20 years. You want your body of work to stand on its own and something that you can be proud of. That does not mean that you don't write things that people actually want to spend their money on, because, a writer invests a lot of time, effort, will, sacrifice of family time, the whole thing to write this book. And if you've given away all of that time and effort and no one buys it, it doesn't matter what you say in the book. If it doesn't see anyone's eyes, then it's kind of a fruitless effort. So balancing that literary and commercial it's just a reality of the world we live in. You can have all the high and lofty goals that you want, but if you don't make it appealing to an audience, then you haven't done anything.
I think it depends if it's something that you really want to make a career out of. I think you have to face the realities of the marketplace. If it's something that you want to define yourself as a writer writes, then I think you don't. So I think I think that there's definitely value in the act itself. But if you're a person who's saying, I want to be making money from this, then you have to just face certain realities to do that, you know, and I think everything we do in life has trade-offs, and so if it feels like too much of a trade-off to say, I'm going to have to change my work too much for the marketplace, then it's deciding that that's not the right avenue for you. But I guess for me, I feel like I've been able to blend the two, especially with How Far She's Come, which is my first, I think, kind of overtly feminist thriller, and it's my first workplace thriller versus being more domestic suspense, like the 3 books previous to it. And so I guess for me, I feel like I go through enough ideas to make sure that the one that I think is marketable and the one I want to pitch is the one I want to write. You know, so I have to discard the ones that either are, like, I think that would be really catchy, but that's not the book I want. I'm not going to be proud of that. I'm not going to want to work on that. I'm not going to want to live with characters. I'm not going to want to inhabit this world, and I'm not going to want to go out and promote it once it's done. If I have an idea that's hooky in that way, but not for me, then I don't do that. So I'm looking for that idea that I think is hooky and that I want to write and that I feel I can write well. So I think it's figuring out how to merge all your personal and professional goals. I think that's kind of something that in every industry people have to face.
Exactly. And I think that's what separates a real writer from a hack, is the ability to write something that will find an audience, but something that you are proud of as well. And just because it's commercial, it doesn't mean that you can't have something to say. You could do both. And I think people get discouraged because they feel like they have to either sell out or they have to write a serious book. And I think you could do both. I really do.
I do too. And I think that you might have to grapple with how you do that for yourself.
Oh, yeah. But I didn't say it was going to be easy.
People say it can't be done. I think in some ways it's like you've got to find the workaround, you know,
exactly.
or you don't do it, or that's not the career for you. That's not the avenue for you. And I think that if you write for yourself for just the sheer pleasure of what you're producing, I think that's wonderful. I couldn't actually do it. I feel like if I didn't have in my mind that things were going to be published, even all in the years that it took me, the years in between, that my chick lit and my first psychological thriller, those years, I always had it in mind that I wanted to make a go of it, you know, that I wanted to sell the books. I really couldn't have sustained any motivation thinking that no one was going to read it. But I think it's wonderful if you can really just say, like, this is a calling, but it's a private calling, and it's something I do for myself. I think that's totally admirable and great. I just know I couldn't keep going. I would have quit basically if I wasn't going to try again to get another agent. If I wasn't going to be like, okay, I'm going to put myself out there again, and I'm going to see if this is the one, you know, if this is the one that sticks. And I was like looking for that to happen, and then I felt really grateful that it did happen in the form of, you know, my second literary agent.
Right, and you have to be able to make peace with those failures of the past, and maybe they're not failures, maybe they're just, you know, things that you went through that haven't found their day yet. But all of that writing that you did made you the better writer that you are now, because that was all experience that was valid. And, the more words you write, the better writer you become.
Absolutely. I believe I think people have debated whether it's really true about the 10,000 hours towards mastery, or if that's just kind of a nice pop, you know, like a pop psychology idea we like. But I don't know if it's 10,000 hours to achieve mastery, but I feel like, you get, and I don't know that I've achieved mastery. I think I've done more than 10,000 hours, and I don't think I've achieved mastery. But I think the idea that you're always improving and that you're always strengthening, you know, the parts of you as a writer that are weaker, and you strengthen them by reading other people who are also better at the things that you're not so strong at, you know. So right. I feel like you're kind of always working on those things, and so I do feel like it's not wasted. I don't feel like it's wasted labor.
Right, exactly. And I think what happens is when you reach that 10,000 hours, what you thought was the finish line was actually just a mile marker. And then you see the next one down the road, and you put in the next 10,000 hours.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of times that you're a therapist also. What brought you to that career, and how do you feel like that influences your writing, or does it?
It definitely influences my writing. The way I found it was that I was in an MFA, a creative writing MFA program, and I was having a great time. In that, basically, it was like the best drinking buddies you can ever have, you know. And so I was really enjoying myself in my creative writing MFA program. But I don't feel like that's actually it was a great fit for me. In that the focus was on writing like a little bit of what I was mentioning, the sort of the MFA type fiction that where it felt like plot was largely irrelevant, and so I wasn't demoralized, and it felt like it tended to be very somber, like it felt like it was sort of this somber, sober kind of prose, and you're supposed to be writing something important all the time, and I wouldn't say I got demoralized exactly, but I wasn't really writing my best because I wasn't writing like myself, and I in terms of the kind of voice I like to use, and I just feel like I was trying to sort of be somebody else. It was kind of this funny like ventriloquism thing that was happening where I was trying to sound like an MFA writer, and I ended up leaving halfway through because I had started thinking that maybe I wasn't talented enough, or I had always been convinced I was talented enough, and I started to say, well, maybe I'm not, or maybe I'm just not willing to work hard enough to get published, because I had this idea that I was only going to get published by writing this MFA kind of writing, which is writing like someone else, and it's an awful lot of work to write like someone else, and so I'd kind of always been interested in psychology and relationships, and that was prominent in my writing, but I had never really thought of having another career. And then I'm like 23 years old, and I have this weekend where I talk to a bunch of different friends who all are sort of simultaneously in crisis, and one of them says, you know, you're really good at this, and I'm like, that's it, I'll be a therapist, because I think I'd been sort of looking for a way out of this thing that I was no longer sure, like it was like kind of like a coat that I wasn't sure if it fit anymore, you know, and so I ended up switching to a graduate program in marriage and family therapy, and for a long time I wasn't a writer because I didn't write, and it was kind of a relief to focus on something else professionally, but I was also kind of focusing on other things personally because I started reading exclusively for pleasure and not reading with an eye to like, how did that writer do that, you know, and what can I learn from this? And so it was fun to like just be a reader, and it was fun to just be a therapist, and it was sort of almost like a different way of living, you know, and so for a long time that's what I did, and then I sort of started just dabbling and playing around with this chick lit thing, just for fun, and then I was able to publish that, and that was a really quick route to publication, was the chick lit thing. That was really like, I wrote the book in like 3 months, and I got an agent immediately, and so all of that stuff, and so but then it kind of gave me the idea again that I can also be a writer, that I can have an authentic voice, and I can leave this like MFA idea behind. And but yeah, in terms of focusing on the therapy, I feel like just it was kind of being immersed in people's stories and people's real life stories, and being immersed in just kind of how people work and how they tick, and how we can sort of be our best selves and our worst selves, and what brings about each. And so I think it was just a lot of sort of engagement in psychology and in dynamics, you know, in relationship dynamics. And so I think all of that definitely came back into play when I started writing again.
After writing the chick lit books, and then you talked about Don't Try to Find Me, and the idea for that book and how it flowed out when you'd kind of come upon that great idea. When that book was published and came out, and you started getting some attention for it, what did that do for you as a writer, and for your confidence? And maybe did you feel like, okay, now I've found the place that I'm supposed to be? And was it easier to continue on after that book?
It is, in large part because once you have an agent, you have sort of a collaborative partner. So whereas for years you're kind of wandering in this wilderness where you have to finish the entire book, and then you send it out, and then you can get this resounding rejection immediately. And the rejection in the form of agents is often you literally don't hear anything back. You query them, and then you get nothing. And what I found is that when that you either hear back really fast or you don't hear back at all usually. So you hear back from them, like they're quick to respond to things that they're interested in. And so typically you'll hear within a few days, you'll send your email query and you'll hear back within a few days if they want to read more, if they're interested. So you kind of, the way it had been for those years, you know, where I wrote those 6 novels with no interest, it was that I would have to finish them in order to know if anyone wanted them. And the truth is that if I had bounced the idea off of an agent, they would have immediately told me, don't write this book in some of those cases. And so I think that one of the things that's very motivating now is that I have this partnership with an agent where I get to go to her and say, okay, I've got 3 ideas. Like, do you like any of them? Do any of them need refining, or any of them about, and so you know what to write next. You know what she feels she can sell, and that's incredibly motivating, as opposed to trying to write something where you just feel like again, like wandering in the wilderness or in the dark or something, and and then by the time the light goes on, which is, I guess I shouldn't have written this book. I guess this isn't a sellable book. It's taken up a good, it's taken up the better part of a year probably to get to that point. So that's one of the things that's been most helpful, is just having that structure in place, that kind of infrastructure, like to back you up, and to have also feedback, to just on the idea itself as you're executing it, so you get a sense of, is this execution the right execution? So all of that is definitely helps a lot with staying really focused and motivated.
Well, let's talk about your new book, How Far She's Come. This novel is extremely topical for the time and place where we're living right now, on many different levels. I have a feeling that it was motivated by something in particular, but I think that is much more relevant to a lot of other situations as time has gone by. What motivated you to write this book, and tell us what the gist of the story is?
Right. So How Far She's Come is the story of a young broadcast journalist named Cheyenne Florian, and so she is recruited by this cable news network called Independent News Network, and sort of their tagline is, because independent thinking is the only way out, and so she goes there and she finds out that basically a lot of, it sounds like kind of a Meet the New Boss, but it's a little bit same as the old boss in terms of how much sort of sexism and sexual harassment is in play there. And while she's there, she discovers a frightening diary from a female broadcaster decades earlier, and so that kind of solidifies the idea that while a lot has changed for women in the media, the dangers of female ambition are just as real. So where that kind of came about was based from the election. I had started writing in November 2016, a couple weeks after the election, and so the book, ultimately, it has a lot of correspondence with the Me Too movement, but that hadn't emerged yet. So I was basically, it was after the election, I was kind of having to grapple with, the fact that a man who'd admitted on tape to grabbing women by the pussy was now the president, and that was very upsetting to me, and I was feeling a little hopeless when I started the book, I think, and I think the Me Too movement coming along actually gave me a lot of hope, and it continues to, because it really makes me feel like the question isn't just how far have we come, it's like how far can we go, and it feels like the conversations that are happening and the push towards changes in corporate policy and legislation that are happening are incredibly heartening. Like I just saw literally today that Uber is going to stop the forced arbitration clause. They're not going to have the forced arbitration clause that's in the user agreement, which means that they can be subject to lawsuits, and which is really incredibly important, because forced arbitration is one of the things that basically gives an unfair advantage always to the corporation against the accuser in cases of harassment and sexism. So that's one of the things. That's sort of one of the things I talk about in the book. But it's not a major part of the book, because I don't want the book to be really preachy. But there is an element in the book that of sort of consciousness raising, and that's part of what I'm most proud of. It's the first book I've written that had this degree of research, and so I was researching the world of morning TV shows and cable news, because the female broadcaster from 1991 is on a morning TV show. And so I had to learn about morning TV shows and cable news past and present, and I had to do a ton of research into sexism and sexual harassment then and now. And so I was kind of educating myself first, and then I had a plot in mind, but the plot changed a lot with more that I learned. It kind of transformed the plot in some ways, and so that's a really different process from how I've written previous books, which were less research heavy. I could map them out a lot more specifically. I could do a lot more outlining and kind of know exactly where I was going, and also there were things from headlines that could change where I was going a little bit in this book. So writing something so timely was really a unique experience also.
Well, and speaking of that, it seems like that you picked a topic that you could reference some of the current events, but that would give you a little space from that to feel free with the fiction. And in the meantime, the headlines have shown us that your idea for the plot was spot on, because we've seen the Matt Lauer thing, which was a morning TV show host, and then a number of other journalists and a number of other media outlets. Almost all of the media outlets have had some sort of embedded just craziness going on that has been covered up and everything throughout all these years. What did that do for you to let you know that you were on the right track when you started to see this stuff unfold in the news?
Some of it's so recent too. Like I think just in the last couple weeks that NBC and CBS both there are lawsuits against them about, like you said, about the cover-ups and about the culture, which is definitely what I was writing about. Is the idea that that there's just these monsters like Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer or Roger Ailes, or the idea that they are sort of just these kind of like serial perpetrators, and that then we can just kind of cut off the head, we can just take out those people. I think that's being disproven by things like these lawsuits, and I think we need to think about the larger culture within corporations and specifically within news outlets, but I think also the larger culture, because it's not the only industry where all of this stuff is happening. It's happening in all of the industries, but that's the sexiest, And so Hollywood and the news outlets are kind of the ones that are they're flashy, and people feel they're familiar with these personalities. When you take down a Matt Lauer or a Charlie Rose or a Louis C.K. or whoever, that people are familiar with them. Whereas if you're sort of cutting off the head of somebody, at GM or wherever, it feels more distant. Like it's like no one had a relationship to that person. But I think that it can divert our focus in some ways, that we can get distracted by thinking we're taking care of the problem by sort of taking out these they're not figureheads because they're obviously perpetrating a lot of things, and the things they're doing, especially if you're sort of a Roger Ailes type, it's trickling down throughout Fox News in terms of the way people are treated. But I think that there are larger questions of culture and ways that things that need to change in terms of how to protect the victims rather than the perpetrators, because in general, corporations, they're protecting their interests. HR typically protects the interests. It protects the people in power. That the rarest thing really is to see the person who's been harassed keep their job and the person who did the harassing lose their job. That's an incredibly rare thing to have happen. And that's what needs to change, and so there needs to be a lot of things that change around that. But yeah, it's definitely gratifying to realize that the points that I was making in the book about kind of the systemic nature of harassment and of misogyny and of sexism. And again, I'm trying to do it in a page-turning, it's weird to say a page-turning fun way, but I would say like in a way that's engrossing and that's one woman's story, but that kind of I think resonates with a lot of women. And but it shows that what's in the zeitgeist, but it also shows that to a different degree, this was happening in 1991, that it's just sexism and misogyny sort of, it can morph over the decades, but we still haven't figured out what to do about it, and right. I think a lot of the conversations are very meaningful in moving it that way, and I'm excited that my book can be part of those conversations. So yeah, that's definitely really gratifying.
Well, I asked you that earlier on purpose about the literary versus commercial, because I know that this book does tackle very timely, very serious issues that we as a society have to get a grip on. So this is a very important book in that sense. But it's also a fun read, and you feel so weird saying that, but it's you care about the characters. First and foremost, you have to care about the characters if you really want to. If you want to connect with readers, you need to build characters that they care about. They have to feel like that there's something at stake there with those characters, and you do that, and you set it in a setting that we all, like you said, feel a little familiar with. This is in our homes every day on the box, in the living room. And so this feels familiar, and we care about the characters. Yet, we're dealing with situations that are deeply important. And you said earlier that you didn't want to be preachy in this book. Well, how do you straddle that fence? How do you deal with things? And especially coming from the place that you do as a therapist, where you do know some of the tools to work through this and to handle the situations and to deal with the interpersonal struggles. How do you convey those things without being preachy? And I know it's a line that we all straddle as writers, but how do you tackle that?
In the case of this book, I think it was with a lot of revisions. I think this went through 7 revisions in a year, so that's by far the most rewrites I've done on a book, especially in such a short span of time. And in part, the many revisions were because of events that were happening, in the world, but they were also because I do feel really passionately about this topic, and so there were certain areas where I was like, okay, I'm giving Cheyenne a speech, and like she can't have a speech here, or she has stories that she covers throughout the book. It doesn't really, I hope it doesn't give too much away, but she covers different stories that are kind of touch on the topic of sexism and about the media and about kind of the culture of hostility towards women in social media. So there's like a lot in the media right now about incels, about the involuntary celibates. And in my book, because the incel terminology wasn't in as much use even like a few months ago, I was talking about pro-rape activists, but they're all part of the same basic sort of vile subculture about the idea that women are the gatekeepers of sex and they shouldn't be allowed to be that, and so it's full of a lot of just hatred of women and just ways that you can. There's just been a lot going on for a while in terms of just kind of how women are treated on social media as opposed to men, like just how sort of gleefully there's all these memes about raping women and torturing them and that sort of thing. So I feel like all of that stuff. I'm raising a child, and she's 6 now, but I feel like it's. And I think I would be taking it fairly personally as a woman in this culture anyway, but I feel like even more so I feel like things are very much on the line for her and for her future, because I'm thinking by the time she's a teenager, I would like people have been talking to their boys about how you treat girls, how you treat and their men, how they treat women, and so I really want this to go well. I feel like I'm really wanting the world to change a lot, and I feel like the world really has changed. I mean, I don't feel like it's certainly imperfect, but I feel like there's certainly an awareness on the part of men, and there's a lot of good men out there who care a lot about what's come out, and really that seeing all those Me Too's was really jarring for them, because they really didn't understand what was so sort of prevalent in the female experience, and they care about it, and they want to reshape the world for their wives and daughters and their sons, and so. But it is a real challenge in terms of, I mean, even I guess in that little speech I just did that you can hear, it matters very deeply to me. And so the thing that I had to be most careful of was and most willing to do is that old idea about kill your darlings, that I would have certain that Cheyenne said, that I was like, but that's really smart. But it doesn't belong there. It doesn't belong in this book at this moment, and maybe I can rework it in later, or maybe I just don't want to hit people over the head. And some people may feel like there's still too much that's preachy in there, but I felt like there were certain things that I couldn't let the moment go without saying. There were certain things that I just felt deeply like it was important to me that certain ideas get across, and so. Yeah, that this is my form of activism, in a sense. This is sort of what I get to do, like where I get to say things that have been really eye-opening to me, like because I feel like I was sort of a little bit blissfully ignorant before the election, because I felt like women really had come further than we actually have. I've always worked in female-dominated industries like therapy and publishing, and maybe I didn't want to believe that there was so much sexism and so much abuse of power that continues to exist, and so I think even though I'm a therapist and I work with people who have trauma histories all the time, I thought certain things were more outliers than they were just sort of ordinary experiences or things that women were encountering with some regularity, and so I feel like I've had my eyes opened, and so there's a feeling that that entertainment can do it differently than nonfiction can. You know, that
Sure,
there's a way
sure.
that, like, by kind of bringing people along in Cheyenne's story, that I can have some role in the conversation, you know. And so, yeah, so I took that all very seriously, but I had to be willing to do a ton of revision.
So the revision, do you treat your first draft, and you mentioned that you write pretty quickly, do you treat that first draft as the draft where you just put it all on the page and just say exactly what you want to say, and then treat the revision as where you go back and put in the nuance, and, you know, maybe this is a sledgehammer, let's go for a velvet hammer here, you know, and, you know, where you get to, okay, I've said everything I want to say, now let me see if I can put this in a way that will be received by a wider audience.
Right.
Is that kind of the idea of the editing?
Yes. So I think also taking a lot of feedback, like getting feedback from both my agent and my editor,
Right.
was important, because you need to hear from other people when things are too heavy-handed, and be willing to take that in. And so I think my first draft was sort of more of like a novel of ideas that didn't conform as much to sort of the rules of my genre, because I am writing within, you know, the psychological thriller, and so there is a feeling that there's and they're not. I mean, they're not ironclad rules, you know, but you can only break so many of them, and you have to break them in such a way that it still serves what people are in it for, if that makes sense.
Right.
That in literary fiction, people are willing to read slower and savor more, and there's a different approach to pacing, and so I knew what I was working, the genre I was working within, and so there's a different way that you deliver the message than if I was writing, and again, more sort of classic literary fiction, and so I'm okay with trying to adhere to those and figure out how to do what I want to do within that, and which is actually kind of a fun and interesting puzzle. I mean, I think it's an interesting mental exercise, but in order to do that, I did have to take in a lot of feedback, so that, like you said, so that I knew I was picking up the right tool at the right time. And again, that's still a matter of subjectivity, where some people could not still feel these parts were heavy-handed, or this part shouldn't have been there, or whatever it is. I mean, you're not going to be able to please everyone. And I know that some people are really going to dislike this novel just for what it's trying to do, you know, that they're just going to feel like they're not in agreement with some of my ideas about the world. And that's less of a problem in a conventional, like the domestic suspense I was writing before that. You know, there was less to disagree about in the wider world, because they were much more contained stories that were about just these. I mean, there were larger psychological points and implications and, you know, that sort of thing. But I wasn't making a statement about society, you know, or about
Right.
where we are or where we're going. Or, I mean, so I know in that way I can get much, I can polarize a lot more with this one than I would have with others.
Well, and, you know, it shouldn't necessarily be polarizing. It is what it is. We can turn on the TV any day and see that this is going on. You know, I think the time for whether, you know, for disagreeing on whether or not it happens, I think that day is gone. So it is what it is at this point. But the book is called How Far She's Come. It's out. It's available now. Holly, how can people get in touch with you if they want to follow you online, and tell us what's up with you next? What are you going to pursue after this book has hit the top of the charts?
Well, they can reach me at, my website is hollybrownbooks.com. I'm on Twitter at hollybrownbooks, and I have an author page on Facebook, so it's just Holly Brown Author. And so getting a hold of me any which way is great with me. And I also have a blog on psychcentral.com, which is a mental health website. And I haven't been updating it as frequently as I ought to, but I have a lot of kind of ideas there about relationships, and it's called Bonding Time. And so a lot of it is about kind of how we strengthen our relationships. And so that's it doesn't have to do with my writing per se, but it is about my other passion, which is mental health and relationships. And so in terms of what's next, this writing a workplace thriller has been really fascinating, gratifying, and I'm always interested in various workplaces in the sort of anthropologically what's going on in them, like what the different cultures of different places. And so I have different settings in mind, and I'm still figuring out who's going to inhabit those settings. But I have a few different workplace thrillers that I'm kind of noodling around with, and I've put out feelers to try to tour some places and to pick some people's brains and follow them around and do a day in the life and just see kind of similar to the way How Far She's Come, a lot of it grew out of my research. I like the idea of going in and seeing different workplaces in different settings and then seeing how that sparks my imagination. So it's a really different way of working, but it's an awful lot of fun, and you get to meet really interesting people, and you get to learn just about how the world works. And so I'm having a really good time with the research at the moment, and so I'll see what it becomes. But I feel like this the workplace thriller, I feel like is it's kind of the road I'd like to stay on for a while.
Nice. Well, Holly, it's been a great pleasure getting to talk with you today. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of How Far She's Come. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come on the show.
Thanks so much. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
They reverently slipped Jason's giant-size X-Men #1 from its mylar protector, drinking in the sweet aroma of browning paper and three-color process that signals only the best and rarest and most wonderful of collectibles. On one page, Professor X raised his fingers to his temples and rallied his X-Men, his psychic commands radiating from his bald head like waves off hot asphalt. "I have psychic powers," Owen blurted. "I want Wolverine's claws." Jason was turning a page. "Snick! Or, hey, get this. Lightsabers poking out the backs of my hands. Or even, no, I'm totally serious. I have psychic powers." "No, you don't." "I do." Jason laid the comic on the bedspread. He sighed. Owen could be such a spaz sometimes. "Okay," he said indulgently. "What number am I thinking of?" "Stop, it doesn't work that way. What I can do is called a psychic reading, off an object, like getting impressions. When the doorbell rings, if I put my hand on the knob, as soon as I do, I know who's there." "It's called looking through the peephole, moron." "Shut up! And when I touch the phone, I know who's calling." "I'm sure, Mr. Bullshit from Bullshit Mountain. Like my sister or my grandmother, I just know it's them." "There's no such thing as psychics." "Okay, you try." "Don't be stupid." "Are you chicken?" "Fine." "Okay." He snatched up a brown paper bag, spotted with grease, and dumped a few stale French fries into the trash can. "I'll put an object in this bag, and you try to guess what it is. Turn your back." Jason did, and heard a rustling behind his head. "Okay, you can look now." Owen produced the bag. It was rounded with some object now. "Don't touch yet, just think. Try to imagine what's inside." "Your lunch?" Jason sneered, but he closed his eyes and tried to imagine. He could hear Owen's breathing. Jason's nose itched. His brain grew bored with nothing to look at, and fragments of images swam in and out of his imagination. "Strawberry," he blurted. Owen reached into the bag, producing a white bowl. Jason had eaten Frosted Flakes from it about 3 days ago. A few stuck to it, like little beige fish scales. "See? I lose." "No, look here." Owen pointed. A design went around the sides of the bowl. A long string of vines and painted fruit. With strawberries. "That's," Jason began, but didn't know how to end the sentence. "It's cool. See? What did I tell you? Do it again." Jason closed his eyes. An image like daisies and sun and yellow, he blurted after 3 seconds. "Oh my God, open your eyes." Owen held a bright yellow highlighter pen. "I hadn't even put it in the bag." And so they went, for 30 minutes or more. A staple remover, a toy soldier, a sweat sock, a pencil. Jason never said precisely what was in the bag, but it was always close or related. He'd imagine a cockpit, and Owen would produce a game controller. He'd say plate, and the object would be a CD. He made right angles with his pointer fingers, shrugging, only to have Owen pull out Eliza's knitting needles. His friend became more and more enthusiastic, but Jason became a little scared. "You have a real gift," Owen said. "You're brilliant." Owen babbled for a long time about astral projection and ESP, how Jason was picking up signals from Owen's own psychic powers, which had obviously been doing the broadcasting. Owen left that night full of plans and experiments, vindicated in his beliefs. Jason sat on the bed after Owen left, thinking hard. He had no explanation for what he'd done, but he knew he hadn't faked it. He couldn't believe, but he couldn't deny either.